So I'm going to spend the next about 30 minutes talking a bit about some of my research. And this lecture shows some of the research that I did that was a small part of my PhD, which I completed in 2018 at the Bartlett in the UK. So this lecture takes a recent typology of informal markets in Cape Town, South Africa, as a starting point to look at the emergence of these spaces as part of a network of forced migration. It questions readings of informality and informal architectures as highly localized within the global South, and talks to the entanglement and complexity of spaces of refuge beyond refugee camps. So this quote by Teju Cole, I think, is really apt here, where he suggests that when one goes to the market to participate in the world. The research, before I go into the research itself, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the research methods. So this research is informed by over 10 months of fieldwork in Cape Town over the course of 2014 and 2015, with 62 formal interviews in addition to numerous informal ones. In addition, I worked with refugee support organizations in the city, some of them run by refugees themselves, and various groups of migrants, whether documented or undocumented, as well as global NGOs with voluntary work. In 2015 and March 2018, I spent several weeks in Minneapolis, the USA, which forms a second site, and you'll see, I'll talk about that a bit later in this talk. And in December 2018, I spent several weeks in Nairobi, Kenya, a third site that is central here. So these second two sites, both Minneapolis and Nairobi, emerged as important through my PhD research, but were sites that I was researching after the PhD itself, and are central to how I'm understanding or theorizing these spaces as part of an argument to look at informality beyond something that is always localized and always associated with the developing world. As you will notice throughout this research, I primarily illustrate the spaces through the use of drawings. The subaltern and marginalized nature of both the populations and spaces discussed in my research raised several questions about the voice of the inhabitants, the assumed transparency of the academic researcher, and the archive itself, the spatial and architectural archive. These were not spaces located in formal spatial archives. This is partially a result of the nature of these spaces as informal sites occupied by refugees, migrants of various formal nature, of various groups of migrants, as well as the contested context in which they exist. At the outset, my primary research approach was intended to be based on ethnographic research, which draws directly from anthropology, including methods of participant observation techniques combined with in-depth interviews. Other sources that I draw on include newspaper archives, urban legislation, public responses, and additional literature. A third object to the research was an inventory of objects and spaces that I was studying. These personal and public histories were then intended to construct a spatial history of the various market sites I was researching. This approach was informed by the field of everyday architectures. However, the contested nature of the sites had a direct impact on the research, and while my initial intention was to document spaces with photography, this proved largely unwelcome on site. This led to an adaptation of the methods to include sketching and note-taking as a way of writing and drawing these spaces. This approach was influenced by Konwajiro and Swati Chattopadhyay, among various others. So this is an example from the work by Swati Chattopadhyay, who is an architectural historian. And her research is historical in the sense that mine was not. But what is interesting, because she's studying Calcutta and she's particularly interested in the colonial parts of Calcutta that were not necessarily documented, she uses drawing as a way of reconstructing sites. And that's the example on the left. And the example on the right is a sketch of a street cricket scene, which comes from her book, Unlearning the City, where she argues for recognizing certain street practices as forms of spatial practices. So in the following slides, apologies, whenever someone enters, I need to admit them, so that's why I'm jumping a bit. So a second key influence for me was Konwajiro's work, who if M1s should be familiar with at this point, because you've looked at some of his work. And for those who don't know, Konwajiro was working in 1920s Japan and was interested in documenting a changing society. Some of his work is directly related to the outcome, to the earthquake in Japan in that period. So it was directly related to a disaster response, but others were not. And what I'm really interested in this is how this work starts to include things that are not usually included within architectural drawings. So in following slides, when I show some of my own drawings, I also include detailed drawings which show the density of occupation of spaces and follow certain architectural conventions. Yet they include goods, furniture, and crockery. In other words, the everyday objects that are not always depicted in architectural drawings. In addition, they're hand-drawn, not precisely measured or scaled, and they lack the authoritative detail that would give them a legal weighting. And this was something I was specifically avoiding because I didn't want to impede on the anonymity of people I was interviewing. Instead, I argue they illustrate a tension between detail and imprecision. Drawing and writing about these spaces is, I argue, a means to recognize these marginalized spaces and spatial practices as relevant to spatial studies. And it is in this vein that I suggest that the complementary use of drawing and writing may offer an alternative way of telling these spaces of refuge, drawing on Edward Said's argument for alternative ways of telling space. The representations do not only trace an observational gesture, but also a remembered gesture. They explicitly position me as a researcher in the field, while presenting alternative ways of inhabiting the city, and therefore perhaps point to something for the future as much as something for the past. I very often speak to non-South African audiences, so you're probably a lot more familiar with the context, but I'll restate it regardless. The dismantling of apartheid and the institution of a non-racial democracy in the early 1990s led to an increasing number of immigrants, migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees coming into South Africa from other African countries. Figures are inaccurate, yet estimates range from 2 to 3 million. In Cape Town, for many of these new entrants who are East African, and in particular Somali, their spaces of inhabitation, established from the mid-1990s, have largely been in informal shopping arcades known as Somali Malls. These are in addition to the spaza shops, which operate in very different ways. These mixed-use markets have been created from old multi-story office blocks or large individual commercial spaces, which have been subdivided into numerous small spaces to host trading stalls, along with various social, religious, and educational services. These malls, and I use the word malls quite loosely, drawing from how they're described, but also quite loosely, are central spaces for migrant populations for gathering, socializing, eating particular foods, and meeting each other. The shops themselves, many of which are run by women, are host to domestic practices, which include caring for families, homework, and meeting friends. Many of these spaces also have residential accommodation. In focusing on homemaking and home unmaking practices evident in these spaces, I argue that these shopping arcades as a whole and the small shops within are central to constituting an alternative sense of home in the context of large-scale forced displacement. Yet beyond the specific shops, the numerous lodges, guest houses, and hotels that are located within these informal shopping arcades, usually on the upper floors, are similarly home-like. And I'm suggesting that these lodges in some ways provide a spatial extension of refugee camp space. They offer a kind of home that exists at the ambivalent border between processes of homemaking and home unmaking. As with refugee camps, they are intended to be temporary and are characterized by transience and rudimentary accommodation. Yet in their occupation within broader networks of urban refuge, they extend beyond the limitations of camp space and hold the potential for social mobility and an alternative future. In an influential 1991 paper titled The Idea of Home, Mary Douglas argued for a reassessment of what home is. In contrast to normative literature at the time, which largely focused on fixed physical domestic space, Douglas argued for seeing the home as what she terms a kind of space, and I use that in quotation marks. A space that is primarily characterized by the regularity of practices, people, and things within a fundamentally not-for-profit space. Douglas's reassessment has notably been taken up in more recent literature, where the focus has been expanded beyond the physical defined space of the nuclear family. These rereadings of home recognize that home is not always ideal, is sometimes a safe space, and at other times could be a space of fear or danger. Yet this literature largely remains dedicated to domestic space, or the spaces behind closed doors. In a distinct approach, Bell Hooks suggests that home is a multiplicity of things and spaces for different groups of people, regardless of material scarcities, asserting the need to question what the home is and to whom. In a somewhat related critique of Douglas's concept of home, Richard Baxter and Catherine Brickell question the emphasis placed on homemaking in particular. They recognize the importance of Douglas's article in noting that homes are created through a set of processes. Yet they also critique the idea that homemaking is the goal of all homes, where homemaking is understood as overwhelmingly positive. Instead, they argue for a recognition of the varied and multiple nature of homes, their different meanings for inhabitants, and how the processes of homemaking always coincide with those of unmaking. And in this article, in some cases, they're talking about processes of homemaking which extend from homes being destroyed and more deliberate attempts at displacement, as well as the act of leaving home, which is a form of an unmaking. So this concept of home unmaking is particularly salient when considering protracted refugee situations, which often involve multiple serial displacements, as with many other contexts. Adopting a view of homemaking in relation to home unmaking enables a broader understanding of refugee homes beyond their localized specificities. This conceptual approach also allows a recognition of the marginal and ambivalent sites that are occupied. Drawing on Bell Hooks' notion of the margin as a site of radical potential, this research further asserts the importance of recognizing these marginal architectures and the associated networks for the potential they might contain, beyond simply seeing them as sites of poverty and lack. Okay, so Somali Malls in Belleville. So as with many prime commercial and residential areas in South Africa, Belleville was classified a white area in 1958 under the Apartheid Group Areas Act laws. And this set of maps shows you where I've identified or mapped out some of the key Somali malls. And this data was last updated in 2016, so it's a bit outdated already. So Belleville was classified a white area in 1958 under the Group Areas Act laws, and here you see one of the Group Areas Act mappings for the Cape Town area. From the 1990s, this northern Cape Town suburb emerged as a central area for Somali Malls and African migrants in general. This is a change that has been seen as problematic by the city. In an interview with the urban manager for the Voortrekker Road City Improvement District, Willem noted that the general problem in the area was the use of buildings for purposes other than their initial intent. Of particular concern to him was that office buildings were being used for sleeping in. Willem described these buildings as overcrowded spaces where immigrants using his phrasing, paid minimum rentals to wealthy and distant slumlords. His detailed explanation of the earnings expressed his outrage over this practice and formed part of his narrative on the need to clean the area up, also his language. Yet while these spaces were clearly exploitative for him, a different story emerged from inhabitants themselves. Instead, they pointed to the importance of these markets and a particular narrative of them understood as being safe for inhabitants. Belstadt Junction, which I show here, is one of these Somali malls and is the space where Fatima has had her shop. Fatima's shop is like many other spaces in Belleville, yet one that I became particularly familiar with, as she was a key contact over the course of my fieldwork. She was instrumental in helping me contact interviewees and guiding me around the area, and as a result, I spent many hours talking to her and drinking tea with her in this small stall. Fatima has been in South Africa since 1997, yet has only had this shop since 2010. She moved to live and work in Belleville after a series of violent experiences in various parts of the Cape Peninsula, in Worcester, Khayelitsha, and Hanover Park. She is the main earner of her family and spends most of her time in this space, at least 10 hours most days, 7 days a week. This small stall, approximately 2.5 square meters in size, is central to her family life, both immediate and extended. They do not sleep in this shop, although this is a prevalent practice in this area. Yet, I argue that this space acts as a kind of home for her family in Cape Town. Most daily meals are eaten within this space, and as a result of the long hours spent there, it was not uncommon to visit her while she was cutting meat, vegetables, or onions, preparing food to cook for her evening meal. The days were punctuated by regular prayer intervals, with guests dropping by, bringing news of violence in the surrounding townships, events in Kenya or Somalia, or the latest update or rumor on resettlement cases from the UN. These practices are not unique to Fatima's stall, but a common practice in the area. Many of the stalls in Somali malls are run by women, particularly those catering to fellow Somalis, as well as other migrant or refugee groups. So, while ostensibly a space for trade, her shop is also a space for eating, homework, and meeting. It is a nurturing space for her immediate family, a space to socialize with friends and extended family. It is a space of caring. Furthermore, its location within Somali malls and within Belleville renders it a safe space in a context with a high level of urban violence, which has taken on a particularly xenophobic character since 2018. So, as mentioned, Fatima herself moved to Belleville after a series of violent encounters in the Cape Peninsula, having fled to South Africa as a refugee in 1997. This shop and area act as a safe space following a series of displacements, and following bell hooks could be understood as a kind of home place. I think I'm meant to be here. This drawing shows both the particular space of the shop, but also the furniture and goods within. The neutrality of these items was made particularly evident through numerous conversations, interviews, and time spent in the space. In the absence of stable houses, these shops often act as kinds of home, and this was evident in the items within and the spatial practices housed in these stalls. Okay. So this is not her shop, this is another shop, but in Som City, Somali Mall. So this is Som City, and that's the name that's been given to it. While the shops within Somali malls take on a home-like character, as mentioned, there are also residential lodges in these markets. In Belleville, the first of these lodges was started on the upper floors of Som City. Som City was started in 2004 by Hassan, a Somali refugee. Hassan noted that the idea of the Somali Mall with a lodge in it came to him from Eastleigh in Nairobi, which he passed through on the way to Cape Town. When 20 Criscal Road in Belleville became available for rent in 2004, he got together with two friends and they decided to make an offer to rent the building. They converted the ground and first floors into businesses, and the upper 3 floors were turned into a lodge. Unlike the female spaces of the shops, the lodges are primarily male spaces. Some City was a former office block and is characterized by a series of small modular spaces. The individual rooms housed between 2 and 6 people. In asking Hassan about the operation of the lodge, I was curious to know whether rooms could be rented out individually, and he answered with a personal response. And I quote, "Because you see, our people, they can't afford it, they don't want to pay. Everybody is saving. As I told you, you see where I start from." End of quote. He referred to his own history in the city, where he started working as a street trader, and noted that he used to live in the lodge himself for the first 2 years of running it. He repeated this several times during our interview, that he lived there himself in room 208. While Some City was the first Somali mall to open a lodge, it soon became a precedent for various other lodges in the area, hosting a combination of transient and longer-term inhabitants. While the lodge is currently a profitable business for Hassan, it is also linked to his personal trajectory in the country. This is a significant detail and common in this type of lodge, where there is no clear opposition between profit and home. This reveals a more intimate relationship with the space and the inhabitants, and a sense of solidarity with the groups who stay there. To return to Mary Douglas, Douglas argued that a home is a kind of embryonic community, which is based on the establishment of solidarity, and is one of the ways, and I would suggest that in the case of these lodges, the personal histories of the owners with the spaces result in a kind of solidarity, and is one of the ways the lodges act as a kind of home despite its profitable intention. So this relationship is further enunciated by the events of 2008. During nationwide xenophobic violence in May 2008, many migrants from around the city and suburbs fled to Belleville. At the time, Some City, along with the neighboring lodges, became important as sites of emergency housing, and the Somali Malls in general were seen as a safe haven. At the time, Hassan opened Some City to those who were left homeless as a result of the violence. He added, and I quote, "I could not tell people just to go out and sleep outside, especially at that time. It was winter, it was May, it was very cold outside. Everybody must come in. If they had money, they paid. If they did not, I said just stay. Some people lost everything." End of quote. In this description, he did not see the profit-making intention of the business in opposition to the site as a form of emergency housing. He noted that those who could afford to pay were still required to do so, yet those who could not and had no alternative means were provided with free accommodation. Therefore, in contrast to Douglas's assertion of the antithesis of profit and not-for-profit spaces, Hassan's description suggests a negotiation depending on the situation. The role of the lodges at sites of emergency housing in 2008 is significant, as it's one of the reasons given for the rise in the number of lodges in this area and the growth of the area as a whole. The response in the area of Belleville is for the accommodation for many of these traders in transient and inexpensive housing, and the continued and consistent subdivision of large spaces into small, multiple sleeping areas. It is also a response to the external rhythms of being a refugee in the city. So on the one hand, these lodges and their spatial practices are closely tied to their particular sites. However, on the other hand, perhaps more than responding to the particularities of life in Cape Town, the Somali lodges respond to population's influx across the continent, along with particular established practices. As briefly mentioned, Hassan's idea to start a lodge was from his brief stop in Nairobi and his stay in Eastleigh, an area known for its large Somali population, along with Somali malls, hotels, and guest houses. The emergence of mixed-use shopping and residential accommodation characterizes the area of Eastleigh and has been described in response to a growing refugee population from the late 1980s, often told through what is referred to as the universal story of Garissa Lodge, frequently described as the first Somali Mall, which when initially started provided residential accommodation at night and became trading spaces in the day. In a recent publication, Ben Rawlins, for example, relates his interlocutor's experience as follows. And he says, and I quote, "The walls were entirely bare, grubby, with the routine of men and work. It was a vessel for sleeping, nothing more. Everything spoke of transience. In that sense, it was just like a camp." Rawlins emphasizes, end of quote, Rawlins emphasizes the bare life of these spaces, where the material deprivation is foregrounded and choices are limited, where these lodges in Eastleigh mirror those of Dadaab refugee camp. However, a more complex view emerges when seeing these as part of a trajectory of spaces connecting Somalia, the border refugee camps in Kenya, and South Africa. On this journey, a further site that emerged as significant is Lusaka in Zambia. In recounting his experience of attempting to travel to South Africa, Mahmoud, a Somali refugee now residing in Minneapolis, USA, described what he described as a motel in Lusaka, Zambia, run by a woman known as Mama Aisha. He said of her, and I quote, "This lady would allow the traveling Somalis and Ethiopians to stay at her home. She also owned a small motel there. If someone could afford to pay her for her hospitality, she would ask for payment. If someone did not have money to pay her, she would allow him or her to stay there free of charge." End of quote. This description closely echoes what was told to me in Cape Town, where the emergence of lodges as profitable businesses is not at the exclusion of offering refuge and hospitality without pay, or indeed a form of care. Mama Aisha was a Somali refugee herself, and as has been described by numerous interviewees, everybody knew her. Mama Aisha's motel was often described as an establishment and was part of a trajectory for Mahmoud that included Doble and Liboy refugee camps on either side of the Kenya-Somalia border and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So these Somali malls were, however, not only described in relation to other spaces on the continent, but during fieldwork in Cape Town, I was frequently told by Somali refugees, in particular, of their hope for a third country resettlement. This hope was largely centered on Minneapolis in Minnesota. I was subsequently able to visit Minneapolis in 2015, and in March 2018 spent a month doing ethnographic fieldwork in the 3 main Somali malls in the city. And this was initially done through contacts from people in Cape Town. Kamal Souk is the earliest of these spaces. Unlike the markets in South Africa, it clearly announces its presence as a Somali mall, with links to the East African coast and the Middle East. Kamal has an old and a new part to it. The old part was created within the fabric of an existing building, while the new part was specifically designed for its purpose, as an extension and due to increasing demand for space. The owner, Basim Sabri, also a refugee himself, bought the site in 1997. He had his own tale of how this Somali mall was started, narrating as follows, and I quote. So he said, "Okay, so about 20 years ago, I got that building there, which the Somalis called Old Carmel. The Somalis began coming to Minnesota, and I was sitting down, smoking a cigar and looking at this place, and I had no idea what I was going to do. The building was falling apart. There was big equipment, storage for a big company, and there it is. There comes a handsome young man with his brother. His name is Nasser. He just walks through the door and he says, 'Is there a coffee shop, and can we have a coffee shop here?' I kind of liked his face, and I said, 'I'll make a coffee shop for you.' It's the first Somali shop in the state of Minnesota. And all of a sudden people started coming in, and that's how the Somali Mall started." Sabri noted that he opened Old Carmel in 1998 with 35 individual businesses, all run by Somali refugees, and the vast majority of them women. Somalis first arrived in Minnesota as refugees in 1993, with newspapers reporting growing and sizable numbers from 1995 onwards. Between the old and new Carmel, there are now 225 trading spaces. And as in Cape Town, these sites are primarily inhabited by Somalis with a few Ethiopian traders, and others from the East African coast. City directories and city records do not reflect the current 225 businesses or occupations, suggesting a semi-informality in how these businesses operate. A City Planning Commission report from 2014 details the complexity of the space and its relationship to the city. While Old Kamel is contained within an existing building and appears, at least externally, to be a fully formal space, it is technically a legally non-conforming use. And as with sites described elsewhere, in Nairobi and in Cape Town, it continues to occupy a semi-formal and contested position. So, in conclusion, to kind of start to wrap up some of these ideas and thoughts, the description of a series of similar kinds of lodges in other parts of the continent and world points to these Somali malls as part of a wider network of similar spaces elsewhere, that in many cases posit refugee camps as one point on a longer trajectory of multiple sites. In these lodges, guest houses or motels, the transient and mostly refugee populations renting beds on a daily basis is not in opposition to a recognition of these spaces as relatively stable sites of refuge, and spaces understood as part of a trajectory for a better future. As Mahmoud had noted, everybody knows about these sites, referring primarily to groups of East African refugees. And as the various vignettes that I've talked to describe, these are similar kinds of spaces found in cities such as Nairobi, Lusaka, and Cape Town. Minneapolis and Johannesburg is a site I didn't mention, but which these sites are also found. Central to recognizing the importance of these sites is to recognize the spatiality of the stories that circulate about them. As de Soto asserts, every story is a spatial story. Every story is a spatial practice. De Soto extends this to argue that narratives are not only descriptive, but also produce geographies of action. He therefore argues that stories are not simply a translation of actions into language, but are instead essential to the organization of actions. And I've suggested here that it is in these narratives of refugees and the stories they tell about where they have been and will go that we find knowledge of the extended spatialities that are essential to livelihoods. Research across these sites reveals an entanglement of these markets, of stories that circulate about them, of goods that travel similar paths, and of people who travel between them. These markets are largely served by Somali women who act as cross-border traders and who draw on transnational networks to support their trade. But to also be quite clear, I'm not suggesting that this spatial type, and I do argue that we could understand it as a contingent spatial typology, I'm not suggesting that it is particularly related to ethnic or cultural identities. In fact, very far from that. Rather, I argue that it points to broader social factors that influence these kinds of spaces, recognizing that many may not be formed out of choice. In these sites that are actively marginalized and rendered informal, taking on Ananya Roy's critique of informality as something that is produced by legal and formal systems, and therefore suggesting that the spatial organization is as much about the particular spatial practices which influence them as it is about the status as migrant or refugee group and their associated subordinate and marginal position within their urban context. Thanks. And these are a few of my other publications, some of which deal with similar themes, but focus in a bit more depth on practices of cross-border trading in some cases, homemaking in other cases, and drawing as a method of research.